In late November 1943, while artillery still thundered across Europe and entire cities lay in ruins, three men gathered inside the Soviet embassy in Tehran to decide the fate of a nation that had not yet surrendered. Tehran Conference brought together Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, allies bound by necessity, not trust. Germany was still fighting fiercely on multiple fronts. Berlin had not fallen, Hitler still ruled. And yet, behind closed doors, the question was already being whispered: what should be done with Germany when the guns finally fell silent? The assumption might be that the division of Germany was carefully engineered from the beginning, a deliberate blueprint drafted in advance. But in Tehran, no such master plan existed. Instead, there were competing fears, rival visions, and calculations about power that stretched far beyond Germany itself. Churchill, ever the imperial strategist, believed German militarism had to be broken permanently. He feared that if Germany were allowed to remain a strong, centralized state, history would repeat itself as it had after the First World War. At one point, he floated the idea of dismantling Germany into smaller entities and even suggested reshaping Central Europe, entirely reviving old political structures such as Austria-Hungary and attaching Bavaria to it. His thinking was rooted in balance of power politics, fragment Germany, and it could never dominate Europe again. Roosevelt was less certain. He understood the emotional appeal of punishing Germany, but he also feared the instability that might follow extreme measures. The memory of the Treaty of Versailles lingered heavily. Had not humiliation and economic devastation helped fuel the rise of Nazism? Roosevelt questioned whether carving Germany apart might plant the seeds of another catastrophe. Yet even he did not possess a fully formed alternative. And then there was Stalin. Stalin rejected Churchill's restructuring proposals outright. The Soviet leader had his own strategic priorities. Red Army forces were bleeding to push westward, and Stalin had no intention of relinquishing influence in territories his soldiers would soon occupy. For him, security meant control. A weakened Germany was desirable, but not at the expense of Soviet leverage in Eastern Europe. Dismembering Germany entirely, he warned, could create chaos, and chaos was unpredictable. By the time the Tehran meetings concluded, no binding agreement had been reached about Germany's political future. Only one certainty emerged: Germany would lose. What followed that defeat remained an open question, suspended in ambiguity. Yet beneath the polite toasts and formal photographs, mistrust simmered. Churchill worried about Soviet expansion. Stalin doubted Western resolve. Roosevelt tried to maintain unity, aware that the war effort depended on cooperation. The alliance held, but it was already beginning to strain. Outside those conference rooms, soldiers were still dying in Italy, in the Atlantic, and across the Eastern Front. The Normandy landings were months away. Berlin seemed distant, but even as the war raged, its conclusion was quietly fracturing. What makes this moment so extraordinary is not what was decided, but what was not. There was no grand architectural design for East and West Germany. No predetermined line slicing the nation in two. Instead, there was hesitation, improvisation, and an unspoken recognition that each power was already calculating how much of Europe it could shape when the dust settled. The peace was being designed before victory was secured, and already that peace was unstable. If you value deep, carefully researched historical storytelling that uncovers the complexity behind familiar outcomes, consider subscribing and liking this video. It helps more viewers discover these nuanced narratives and ensures that history is remembered not as myth, but as lived uncertainty. Because in Tehran, Germany's future was not decided, it was postponed. And postponement in the volatile world of 1943 was its own kind of danger. By February 1945, the war in Europe was visibly collapsing in on itself. Soviet troops were advancing from the east, Anglo-American forces from the west. German cities were reduced to rubble. The Third Reich was dying. And yet, as the leaders of the Allied powers met again at the Crimean resort of Yalta, the question of what would replace Hitler's regime remained unresolved. The Yalta Conference was meant to provide clarity. Instead, it revealed how fragile Allied unity had become. The setting itself seemed almost surreal. The WWII Palace, once a summer retreat for Russian Tsars, now hosted the architects of post-war Europe. Winston Churchill arrived determined to preserve British influence despite his country's exhaustion. Franklin D. Roosevelt, visibly weakened by illness, sought to secure Soviet cooperation in the final defeat of Germany and in the coming war against Japan. Joseph Stalin, confident after the Red Army's sweeping victories, negotiated from a position of strength. On paper, there was agreement. Germany would be occupied. It would be divided into zones administered by the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and eventually France. Berlin itself, though deep within the Soviet zone, would also be partitioned. These arrangements appeared orderly, even cooperative. But beneath the formal communiques lay deep uncertainty. Britain faced an uncomfortable truth: years of total war had drained its treasury. Maintaining a prolonged occupation of Germany would be costly, perhaps unsustainably so. Churchill worried not only about Germany's future, but about Britain's declining ability to shape it. The United States, economically dominant, could afford long-term commitments. Britain could not. The Soviets, meanwhile, insisted on heavy reparations. Their country had suffered devastation on a scale unmatched in the West. Entire regions were destroyed. Millions were dead. Stalin demanded compensation and security guarantees. A divided Germany, from his perspective, might serve as a buffer. But he was cautious about endorsing permanent fragmentation too soon. Publicly, he spoke of unity. Privately, he calculated influence. A joint committee was established to plan Germany's political and economic structure. It was a bureaucratic solution to a political problem, yet the committee achieved little. Fundamental disagreements persisted. Should Germany be dismantled or rebuilt? Punished or rehabilitated? Centralized or federalized? Each proposal reflected deeper ideological divides. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the alliance began transforming into something else. Roosevelt still believed cooperation with the Soviet Union was possible. He envisioned a post-war order governed by collective security and the newly forming United Nations. But many in Washington were less optimistic. Intelligence reports from Eastern Europe described growing Soviet control in Poland and beyond. Promises of free elections seemed increasingly conditional. Churchill grew alarmed. He saw in Soviet actions not partnership, but expansion. Yet he lacked the leverage to challenge Stalin decisively. Britain was too weakened. The United States remained focused on ending the war swiftly. At Yalta, documents were signed, photographs were taken. Public statements emphasized unity, but the substance of agreement was thinner than it appeared. The occupation zones were presented as temporary administrative measures, practical steps to manage a defeated enemy. Feebly acknowledged that temporary arrangements have a way of hardening. As the conference concluded, the leaders departed believing they had preserved cooperation long enough to finish the war. Germany would be occupied jointly, its future would be determined collectively. That was the official line, but the deeper truth was more unsettling. Each power was already imagining a different Germany. And when imagination diverges, policy eventually follows. Within months, Roosevelt would be dead. Churchill would lose office. Only Stalin would remain, presiding over an Eastern Europe increasingly under Soviet influence. The personalities that had held the alliance together were changing just as the war itself was ending. The agreements at Yalta were not meaningless. They established structures that would shape Germany's immediate post-war administration. But they did not resolve the core question: would Germany become a unified democratic state, a permanently weakened collection of regions, or something else entirely? The illusion of consensus masked a deeper competition, and as the guns fell silent in May 1945, that competition would begin to define the peace far more than the war ever had. In the midst of uncertainty over Germany's fate, one proposal emerged that seemed to offer brutal clarity. It did not call for negotiation, gradual reform, or cautious reconstruction. It called for transformation so severe that Germany would never again possess the means to threaten Europe. The architect of this idea was Henry Morgenthau Jr., and his plan would ignite one of the most controversial debates of the war. Morgenthau believed the root of German aggression lay in its industrial strength. The factories of the Ruhr, the coal and steel complexes that had powered both world wars, were in his view the engines of militarism. Remove the machinery, dismantle the heavy industry, and Germany would be reduced to an agrarian society incapable of rearmament. No steel mills, no armaments plants, no industrial backbone. Without those, war would be impossible. He presented his proposal directly to Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1944. The plan envisioned dividing Germany into separate states, internationalizing the Ruhr, and redistributing certain territories to neighboring countries. What remained would be economically pastoral, focused on agriculture rather than manufacturing. It was not merely punishment, it was preventative restructuring. At first, Roosevelt showed interest. He was still grappling with how to avoid the perceived mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles. The emotional weight of Nazi atrocities also loomed large. How could the Allies justify leniency after the devastation Germany had unleashed? The Morgenthau Plan appeared decisive, morally firm, and strategically preventative, but agreement did not last. When Winston Churchill encountered the proposal, he reacted with caution. Britain's economy, battered by war, depended heavily on European trade. A deindustrialized Germany might weaken the entire continent's recovery. Churchill initially resisted until financial negotiations with the United States made him temporarily more receptive. Even then, doubts lingered. Then the backlash began. American officials warned that stripping Germany of industry could create widespread famine and humanitarian catastrophe. Europe's economic network was interconnected. German coal fueled neighboring economies. Its factories supplied essential goods. A collapsed Germany might destabilize not only itself, but the entire region. Critics feared the plan would breed resentment rather than stability, echoing the very conditions that had enabled extremism in the past. News of the proposal leaked to the press. Nazi propagandists seized upon it, portraying Allied intentions as vindictive and destructive. Instead of weakening German morale, the plan risked hardening resistance. The political cost became evident. Within months, the Morgenthau Plan lost momentum. Roosevelt distanced himself from its more extreme elements. Policy discussions shifted toward reconstruction rather than dismantlement. The language of permanent pastoralization faded from official strategy, but something important had happened. The very existence of the Morgenthau Plan revealed how uncertain the Allies remained about Germany's future. There was no consensus blueprint. One faction argued for industrial destruction, another for supervised recovery. Still others envisioned a unified but demilitarized state. And hovering over all of it was the growing tension between East and West. The Soviet Union had its own approach. Rather than dismantle industry outright, Soviet authorities began removing machinery from their occupation zone as reparations. Factories were disassembled and transported east. It was not deindustrialization in theory, it was extraction in practice. The Western Allies began to reconsider their position. A stable, economically viable Germany might serve as a counterweight to Soviet influence. What had once been framed as punishment increasingly became a question of geopolitical balance. If you appreciate in-depth historical analysis that goes beyond simplified narrative stories that reveal how fragile and improvised decisions truly were, consider subscribing and liking this video. It helps others discover thoughtful, fact-driven history and keeps this kind of storytelling alive. Because by the time Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, no definitive plan had triumphed. There was occupation, there were zones, there were competing ideologies. But there was still no fixed decision to divide Germany permanently. And yet, within 4 years, two German states would stand facing each other across a hardened border. The blueprint had never been finalized, so how did temporary occupation become permanent division? In May 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. The guns fell silent, cities lay in ruins, and the Allied powers assumed control over a defeated nation. According to prior agreements reached at Tehran and Yalta, Germany was divided into four military occupation zones: American, British, Soviet, and French. Berlin, though deep within the Soviet zone, was likewise partitioned. These lines were drawn for administration, not permanence. At least, that was the intention. At first, the occupation authorities spoke the language of cooperation. Germany would be governed jointly through the Allied Control Council. Policies would be coordinated. The country would be demilitarized, denazified, democratized. The rhetoric was collective. The reality quickly became fragmented. The Soviet Union consolidated its authority in the Eastern Zone, overseeing land reforms and encouraging the merger of communist and socialist parties into a single political force. In the West, American and British officials began focusing on economic stabilization. Food shortages were severe, infrastructure was broken. Millions of refugees flooded across shattered borders. Rebuilding Germany was not simply a moral concern, it was a practical necessity for Europe's survival. Then the political climate shifted. As tensions between former allies intensified, Germany's future became inseparable from the emerging Cold War. The United States announced the Marshall Plan in 1947, offering economic assistance to rebuild Europe. The Soviet Union rejected participation and forbade Eastern European states from accepting aid. Germany stood at the fault line of this widening divide. In the Western zones, economic reform accelerated. The American and British sectors were merged into Bizonia, later joined by the French zone. A new currency, the Deutschmark, was introduced in 1948 to stabilize the collapsing economy. For the Soviets, this was a unilateral move that threatened their influence in Berlin. In response, the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin in June 1948, cutting off all ground access. The city, isolated within the Soviet zone, appeared vulnerable. But instead of retreating, the Western Allies launched the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, aircraft delivered food, fuel, and supplies to sustain the city's population. The blockade failed, but the psychological line dividing Germany had hardened. Trust had evaporated. By 1949, the transformation was complete. In May, the Western zones formally established the Federal Republic of Germany. West Germany aligned politically and economically with the Western powers. In October, the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic. East Germany structured under socialist governance. Federal Republic of Germany and German Democratic Republic now faced one another across a border that had never been envisioned as permanent. There had been no single decisive moment in which the Allies declared, "Germany shall be divided forever." No master blueprint drafted in 1943 or 1945. Instead, a series of improvised decisions: occupation zones, economic reforms, political consolidation gradually solidified into separate states. Fear drove policy, ideology shaped interpretation. Economic necessity altered strategy. What began as a wartime alliance had become a geopolitical rivalry. Germany, once the aggressor of Europe, was now the front line of a new global struggle. And so the division of Germany was not the inevitable outcome of victory. It was the unintended consequence of mistrust between former allies, of shifting priorities, clashing visions, and the accelerating onset of the Cold War. The lines drawn in 1945 were meant to manage defeat. By 1949, they defined a divided continent. Germany would remain split for 4 decades until 1990, its people living parallel histories shaped by systems born not from careful design, but from uncertainty. History often tempts us with clean explanations. But Germany's division reminds us that the peace after war is rarely crafted with perfect foresight. It is negotiated in fragments, adjusted under pressure, and hardened by suspicion. Sometimes, the most enduring borders are not drawn by intention but by fear.